just to set a bit of context, we all know that transport is very important. It's no coincidence that the Industrial Revolution happened in Manchester at the same time as the canal network grew up. But we have some problems here. According to the World Economic Forum, we're only 27th for the quality of our roads and 19th for the railways. We're quite topical today, so as you've probably all seen, the Chancellor is announcing 300 million to apparently future-proof the railway network, and another 100 million, which might or might not be new money for the roads. I think Chris Grayling is going to announce about an hour. That's not to say that transport is a silver bullet. Transport can help accelerate growth, but there's a lot less clear evidence whether it can start it in the first place. We don't have a huge amount of good evidence either way. The What Works Centres for Local Economic Growth, I think, to quote them, says the evidence on local economic benefits is not clear-cut, but there you go. But that's not saying it's bad either. So what we wanted to discuss today was really a middle ground, a practical. We don't want to be too shy and say this is a silver bullet, but we also don't want to say it's unimportant. We want to find that central middle place. So we want to look at what are the biggest problems with transport today, what opportunities are coming up as well, so how can we take more advantage of things like HS2, free, however many they end up being, electric cars, self-driving cars, a lot of it. Should we be investing more outside of London? A lot of people at our event this morning seem to think that we should. Is it fair that we spend 3 times more per person on infrastructure in London than in the Midlands? Are we valuing the benefits of transport the right way? That very one key question that gets asked every time about web tag and all that. What are the practical things we could do to make local transport better? How does it fit into the industrial strategy? And should we be focusing on big headline projects like HS2, or should we be worrying more about small kind of local pinch points, to go back to the Eddington agenda? So we have 4 speakers today who will each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes before we take it to questions. So on my right is David Horne, who's the Managing Director for Virgin Trains East Coast. On my left is Naomi Clayton, who's the Policy and Research Manager at the Centre for Cities. And on the far left is Councillor Carl Lads, who's the County Councillor for North Yorkshire, and also the Director of the Wensleydale Railway, which I'd be interested in hearing more about. But David, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Good afternoon. Great to be here, particularly in Manchester, which we'll come back to shortly. So I think, certainly our view is that very strongly transport connectivity has got a very direct and clear link to driving both economic activity and productivity, as well as benefiting communities across the country. Manchester is absolutely one of the key markets, of course, for our Virgin Trains West Coast business. Took over West Coast in 1997 when there were roughly 14 million passenger journeys made on that route, and it took 2 hours 41 minutes to go from London to Manchester. And of course now the journey to Manchester is completely transformed. Between here and London, journey's just over 2 hours, and then almost 3 times as many passengers are travelling on the West Coast main line than they were 20 years ago. And I think it has contributed, been a big contributor to the economic success that we see in Manchester today. Now our mission is to see if we can replicate that growth for the East Coast route as well, which about 30 years ago went through a big transformation when the route was electrified, but now is a very busy intercity route, long-distance route, between our East Coast cities, Yorkshire, the North East, and Eastern Scotland, and London, of course. And our mission is to introduce a fleet of new trains to speed up journeys and to drive economic growth on the East Coast. We've started by improving our existing services with our existing trains. We've invested something like £75 million already in the last 2.5 years, improving the trains and adding more services onto the route. That has put us at the top of the satisfaction league table for our customers. And in addition to that, we've been paying 30% more to the Treasury than East Coast did under public ownership during the 5 years before we took over. We have had some success already, and it's worth touching on the growth that we've seen out of both Edinburgh and Leeds, where we're now up to a half-hourly train service and in the case of Leeds, 6 days a week service now between Leeds and London. And we've seen strong growth out of both markets in response to us providing extra services and extra capacity. So I think we can take some confidence that where we improve the services, we do see the market respond and more customers travel, whether that's for more leisure trips or indeed taking advantage in terms of better business connectivity as well. As in Middlesbrough last week and on Thursday last week, and Middlesbrough is a place which we're absolutely targeting as part of our future plans. So Middlesbrough's got roughly 500,000 people within a reasonable catchment of its station, but it has no direct train service to London at the moment. You know, can you imagine a city like like Liverpool or Bristol, which are roughly equivalent in terms of catchment, not having a direct service to London? So we're going to do something about that, and we're going to be introducing direct services between Middlesbrough and a number of other cities on our route, using our new Zuma trains when they come in 2018 and 2019. And this is absolutely needed, of course, because the house building is also coming. Towns like Grantham are becoming really popular in terms of commuting into London as people look further afield, and so we're providing extra capacity as well. Now, there's work to do. You know, this does depend on further infrastructure investment. We'll come on to the discussion in terms of should it be HS2 or should it be more local schemes, but absolutely to make the most of the investment that the government's making in the trains, which are being built in the northeast by Hitachi. We absolutely need to complement that with further infrastructure investment, and we'll perhaps return to that later. So there's a whole package that's needed, and there's a whole package as well in terms of how we interface with our communities. And just one example, as well as bringing benefits to our communities through improving the transport, we're also looking to get out there into our communities to tackle deprivation at source. And we support and encourage our employees, for example, to engage with breakfast clubs in primary schools, both in West Yorkshire and in Scotland, but simply by going out and providing breakfast to the kids in these schools. And that's a very small and local example, but something that makes a big difference in those schools and those communities. So plenty that's coming, plenty that we've been doing, but a real opportunity, we believe, to drive growth on the East Coast to match the growth that we've seen already on the West Coast.
Okay, great, thank you. Naomi, do you want to go next?
Great. So for those of you that don't know Centre for Cities, we're an independent research organisation, and our remit is to support economic growth in UK cities. And by UK cities, we mean the 63 largest urban economies right across the UK. So my starting point is that transport investment must support cities, or our major conurbations. Regions do well because they have strong cities at the heart of them, and the concentration of economic activity in our cities drives up productivity because of the agglomeration benefits that businesses derive from being in close proximity to each other. So absolutely there is a clear case for improving transport between cities. We know that it supports access to larger markets, it supports innovation and productivity, and of course it's an important part of growing the North and Midlands economies. And indeed, when we look at the train connections between many of our cities, we can see that they are relatively slow and infrequent. So look at the connection between Manchester and Leeds, and it takes 50% longer to travel between those two cities than compared to London and Milton Keynes, despite the distance being shorter. And of course, this is why we've seen the focus on the Northern Powerhouse rail project, and the announcement recently from Philip Hammond with the £300 million investment in improving those rail links. But if the positive impacts of better connecting our cities are to be realised, then the cities themselves have to have strong economies. And this means that we can't lose sight of the importance of intra-city transport connections and supporting and investing in those smaller scale transport projects. And the importance of skills, because we know that that's a fundamental issue when it comes to the economic performance of our cities. So this means, firstly, that we need to coordinate and integrate rail with other modes of transport within our city regions. We know that transport systems within city regions are fundamental in terms of enabling businesses to access workers and enabling workers to access jobs. So we know, for instance, here in Greater Manchester, most people that work in the city region live in the city region as well, or the nearby surrounding rural areas. London, on the other hand, has a huge travel to work area, in part because of the very strong kind of push-pull factors in the capital, in the form of high wages and high house prices, which means that people are willing to travel further to jobs in the capital. So in many ways, we need to be thinking about Crossrail for Leeds and Manchester, not just Crossrail for the north. And this means that we need to keep up the momentum on devolution. So we need kind of a single consolidated management of transport systems within our city regions, and we need to ensure that national systems and investment is coordinated with local ones too. So of course there's been a huge amount of debate recently over the levels of investment in London versus the north, and of course Andy Burnham has been very vocal on this, as has a number of other people. But I think if there's one area where London has been given unfair preference in terms of policy privileges, it's in the kind of levels of kind of autonomy and power that the city has in the form of a mayor, the degree of devolution and levels of autonomy the city and the mayor's office have achieved, and in having Transport for London. So my kind of first argument would be that we need to maintain the momentum over transport devolution to enable city regions to make the most of the kind of investment in the big infrastructure projects. So we need the buses bill to give combined authorities the bus franchising that was promised in the devolution deals. So that's, allowing them to set routes, frequencies and quality standards alongside longer term funding settlements. And the second area is that we need very much to be seeing transport investment as part of the wider policy mix. So if we're going to maximise the impact of investment in these big infrastructure projects, it's not only about integrating with different forms and modes of transport, it's about the importance of investment in skills too. So as Jonathan was saying, transport can really only kind of enable and facilitate growth where you have those strong economic fundamentals, and arguably we need to be investing in skills quite heavily in cities in the North and Midlands so that they can grow their economies. So yes, big infrastructure, transport infrastructure can have a very important impact, but it needs to be seen as part of the wider kind of transport infrastructure investment and part of the wider policy mix too.
Thank you very much. And Carl?
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm the leader of North Yorkshire County Council, which is actually the largest geographical county council in the country. We have 3,000 square miles. We often joke that we have more sheep than we have people, but in actual fact that is reality. We actually have 625,000 residents, and we are therefore a sparse area. If you strip out the urban conurbations that we have of Harrogate and Scarborough, then we actually, in many places, we're super sparse. We sit in the Netherlands of 2 or 3 city regions, Leeds being the biggest, but also Middlesbrough to the north. And we have our own city within North Yorkshire, which is York, although it's a separate authority. And then we have Hull down the Humber. In looking at rail, I think we would share everybody's values about we want frequent services, we want reliability, and sadly the East Coast Main Line has a very bad reputation for reliability, and we want it to be affordable as well. We have a dichotomy perhaps that access is more important to us than speed. We've actually got to get to the railway to actually use it, and that's not easy for our population. We have 3 mainline stations in North Yorkshire and of course the York hub. But we've got to use the car because we have very, very few bus services. We've got to use the car to get to the railway, to actually use the train. And when we get to the railway, then we find that there's the parking arrangements are not good. The car parks are small, not talking about the price so much, but the size of the car parks usually means that we have to go and do displacement parking and cause nuisance to other residents. But our real priority for transport is actually roads. I've lived and worked all my life on the Great North Road. First it was the A1, then it became the A1 trunk road with numerous bypasses of dual carriageway, and now it is A1 motorway, shortly to be opened and complete between Newcastle and London. So we have, generally speaking, we have quite good north-south connections, both rail and road, road with A1 and A19, but actually our east-west connections are quite frankly abysmal. The A66 that goes over the Pennines frequently closes in the winter as soon as there's high wind or there's an element of snow. The A59 gets snowed out by traffic as soon as anything happens on the M62, and it's a road that just can't cope with it. The A64, the road that actually goes from York to the coast, interestingly, it was first announced that it was going to be improved in 1913, before the First World War. And the newspaper cutting says it was announced by the government that they would improve the A64 motor road so that the masses, their words, could go more easily for their annual holiday to the coast. So here we are 100 years plus later on, we still haven't got a dual carriageway to the coast, which I think would be the single biggest factor to unlock the economy of the coast. And to get to the A64, if you're coming from North Yorkshire, you've got to use the York Ring Road, which again is just a car park at the best of times. So I think my priorities would be to say, let's not forget about roads. That's actually more important to North Yorkshire than rail. But with regard to rail, give us access to the main line as well and make the main line more usable by being more reliable. Thank you.
Thank you. So a couple of questions for me before we open it up. So I think something you mentioned, Naomi, was the problem we have within cities and transport links. And you do definitely get the sense that that's something the UK definitely doesn't do very well at. It's outside London, the kind of in travelling, commuting within cities, and also these kind of road pinch points and traffic jams that people have been whining about for decades. Is the UK particularly bad at that, do you think, and why would be my big question?
I think the LSE Growth Commission, when they were looking at transport infrastructure investment in this country, said it marked a persistent and historic failure. So I think historically we have been bad and under-invested in general in transport infrastructure. And I think what's needed going forward is for city regions to have the kind of real power to integrate and make these decisions at the local level, so that you overcome these kind of pinch points and you're able to properly connect different modes of transport and improve connections across city regions.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? No? Okay. And you've kind of dropped into my next question then, which is, if one of the reasons that we do badly at this is kind of over-centralisation, who should be making these decisions? Do you think it's city regions? Is it because the national government makes too many decisions? I'm going to look at you and realise this might politically difficult, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, the policy framework is shifting still in favour of devolution, and I think ultimately people at a regional level or at a city level are far more able to make the right calls and judgments. And I think when you look at some of the cases, and we might say, has it that particular investment delivered the right outcomes? We might say, actually, is it possible to always get it right when the decisions are being made in Westminster and in Whitehall? So there's a really interesting shift and a policy shift at the moment in terms of Rail North taking responsibility for the Trans-Pennine and Northern franchises, where you have a franchise management team from the Department for Transport embedded in Leeds with Rail North and able to influence those two franchises. Now, they're a bit of a test bed at the moment. That's not a model that's been rolled out elsewhere, but it's bound to lead to better engagement with other train operators such as ourselves, who are based outside of London, and indeed Network Rail, who have their regional offices in York for the East Coast and in Manchester in terms of the North West. I think it's got everything going for it. But take a route like the East Coast Main Line. This is a route which serves communities that represent close on 50% of UK GDP. So inevitably, you've got to look at that from a national perspective. We've got to make the case for investment at a national level, including Scotland, and the contribution that both of the East Coast and West Coast routes makes to the Scottish economy as well.
Carl, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm a fan of devolution, I have to say. I'd much rather see decisions moved away from Whitehall and down to town halls. We would have to have an elected mayor, accept that. It may not be the same colour as my party, accept that. The only thing I would ask of the mayor, that they have a decent cabinet working with them, so that there is a degree of fairness in everything. So it isn't just about who shouts the loudest gets the most. When we had the Regional Transport Board in the north, in Yorkshire, we didn't get a huge amount out of it for North Yorkshire, but we got a share, and we were happy with that.
Okay. All right, I think I'm going to open up to all your questions. If you can all make sure to say your name, your organisation, and include a real question. Gentleman at the front there.
Graham Nolte, Conservative Transport Group. A question for David Horne, or two parts. First part, how frequent, I'm delighted to hear you serve Middlesbrough, but how how many trains per hour, or rather hours per train, are you planning on? The second part is, about 15 or so years ago, I asked the previous franchisee about the East Coast Main Line service covering Cambridge. Had an interesting answer. It was that the market for Cambridge is not sufficient to fill an hourly train, so it wasn't part of their business model. So how frequently do you intend serving the Middlesbrough from London firstly? And have you any thoughts of running via Cambridge at the present time?
So Middlesbrough will get a service every 2 hours initially. That's the timetable that we have committed to, and that will be in common with Bradford, which will go up to a 2-hourly service, Harrogate and Lincoln. So those other destinations we serve once a day at the moment, and we'll put in a 2-hourly service. Then who knows where that might then develop. It's worth saying that in terms of Middlesbrough is also going to benefit from many more Transpennine and Northern services that they're rolling out as part of their franchises. I think Cambridge is a really interesting one, and it's not part of our plans at the moment. And really, when our franchise was awarded and under the tendering process that we were responding to, the drive was very much about providing better connectivity between London and our existing cities and the new sort of destinations that I've referred to. But clearly, Cambridge is one of those places that is a key driver of economic growth, particularly in terms of what we might describe as the new economy. We see many people travelling on our services to Cambridge now. They tend to change at Peterborough or actually go via London. And I think absolutely the case is there to look at further development of services. It does require the infrastructure investments to be made, but that is needed also for some of the other journeys and services that I've mentioned. And I think there's a degree of recognition that some of these links need to be improved. The East-West Railway serving Oxford and Cambridge, of course, is something that the current Secretary of State has championed very much in his time in office. So I think there is a degree of recognition, but it's one of those things that will require a bit of work to do, because as ever, we have a rail network which is extremely busy, and putting new services like that on isn't straightforward.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Logan. I'm from West Dorset in the South West. I have two questions to ask. The first is local government reform strikes me as to be one of the largest catalysts to encourage third-party investment into the railway infrastructure to allow more capacity to be operated. So, for example, Section 106 contributions from planning applications or from planning commissions and the like do have a role to play, in my view, in enhancing the railway network as they do the road network, and I'd just be interested in your view on that. My second brief question is related to Network Rail. Network Rail is probably the largest component in the rail industry. It is in effect nationalised. If there ought to be a conversation, a national conversation, about the prospect of further privatisation in some ways of Network Rail to speed up some of these opportunities that there are.
I was wondering if nationalisation was going to come up, but that wasn't the angle I thought it was going to come. Carl and Naomi, do any of you want to start on that one?
I'll have a go at it. I do agree with you about local government reform and the fact that there is this opportunity, and interestingly we are actually talking to somebody at the moment about the fact that Network Rail were promising better connections between York and Harrogate and now saying that they're unaffordable. So we're trying to find a way of making them affordable, and we'll let you know how that works in future, because we're now talking to the Treasury about that. But you make the point about Section 106, and it is a valid point. At the moment, in the Harrogate part of North Yorkshire, there's a garden village being planned and a large business park. And certainly the garden village needs a rail connection. The business park actually wants to provide one. So it'll be interesting to see whether that comes about. With regard to Network Rail and further privatisation, I don't know.
Naomi?
On privatisation, nationalisation, I know that Paul Johnson has written an interesting article on this for the Times today, considering both sides of the argument, and it's kind of not clear-cut kind of either way in terms of overcoming market failures and the costs of nationalisation. The point you raise about kind of third-party investment in rail and connectivity is an interesting one, and I think that's something that's been considered as kind of wider part of economic development more generally, and how local authorities and cities can unlock investment to support economic development more generally. And I know Section 106 is one of those areas that they're considering. Certainly across the country, local authorities and local government is becoming much more kind of entrepreneurial in terms of its approach to economic development. So,
great.
Interesting point.
Do we need regional rail companies to break up Network Rail, as people keep calling it?
I don't think the time for that is now. I think clearly our focus at the moment needs to be on making the case for the amount of privatised railway that we have, because I don't think we've got public support universally at the moment. So that's what we need to do, and that's what we're focused on. I was at a seminar 2 weeks ago with the rail regulator looking at Network Rail's efficiency levels, and actually one of the key messages from that and from the supply chain was that stability is what's important to Network Rail at the moment, and ultimately will lead to better efficiency over the next 5 years. So I think there's more to go for in terms of that at the moment. I think in terms of local authorities and investment in the rail network, the East Coast is full of opportunity. I think right next to most of our key stations in our cities, whether that's Newcastle, Leeds, York, we have enterprise zones that are struggling to get off the ground in terms of generating the development and the economic growth that's intended. But fantastic sites, because right back next to rail hubs. So if we can, and actually this is where local authorities need a bit of freedom to provide better connectivity between the hubs and the pockets of land that form the enterprise zones. So there's definitely something to go for there.
What kind of freedoms are there?
I think, so if you take Newcastle, where we have a big enterprise zone on the east of the main station in Newcastle, called the Stevenson Quarter. At the moment, it is not at all connected to the railway station and the metro station, which are in the same location. The City Council want to invest in a new access to link the station to the enterprise zone. So, relatively modest infrastructure investment, but they're dependent on decisions from central government to make that happen. So we've got to find a way to unlock that type of thing, because if we can provide the access between these big transport hubs and the land which is there for development, then that development will just fly.
Great. Next, gentleman there.
Looking at the question, how can transport investment boost your growth? Martin Bolt from West Yorkshire Transport Committee. Don't we need to seek effective transport planning when authorities are given investment funds? Looking at a few examples, Leeds built the White Rose Shopping Centre just outside Leeds, adjacent to a railway line. They didn't get the developer to pay for it. Now that's going to cost £15 million of public money for a rail hub there. As Carl mentioned, York has got a single lane northern bypass. It's now seeking funding to widen it because it wasn't planned properly. They'll culminate in a road junction, I think it's Hop Road, that's probably had the Highways Agency visited about 5 times in the last decade, and they still haven't solved the problem. So we need to see effective transport planning to make sure the investment is being used properly, and that will stimulate regional growth.
And why do you think that's not happening at the moment, do you think?
Because probably the local authorities and transport authorities and up to Highways England are failing. To give you an example, in West Yorkshire, in 1993 the government shelved a motorway link road because it was unfeasible. West Yorkshire Combined Authority, at the behest of Kirklees Council, are now investing money in a feasibility study to see if they can use the same route for an A-class road. If it was overcrowded and not feasible in 1993, in 2017 won't it be even more overcrowded as an A-class road? So people are throwing public money down the drain. We need to see effective transport planning.
Do either of you guys want to comment on that? Are we very bad at transport planning?
I think we are, and I would certainly agree that we need to do it better. And a case in point about the York Ring Road, single track road. Then City of York Council gave planning consent for office development and big retail development on it, and then that generated its own traffic for the Ring Road. Hopgrove Roundabout, good case in point on the A64, this beast of a road that we keep talking about. Hopgrove roundabout has had numerous attempts at it, and the latest one is the Highways England saying that they want to spend £130 million putting a flyover over it and making it a grade separated junction. We've actually managed to persuade them to spend that money on further dual carriageway from Hopgrove further up, another 13 miles of it, which we think would be better money, better well spent. With regard to Highways England, what I would say is scrap them. Give the strategic road network back to the county council, the unitaries who already manage the principal road network. But that's perhaps a controversial point of view. But I've had experience of dealing with Highways England, Highways Agency as it used to be.
Naomi, any thoughts?
I think we probably could always be more effective when it comes to transport planning. I think it's particularly important when you're thinking about access to jobs and planning around kind of office sites. I mean, we did some work a while ago looking at the dispersal of jobs and particularly low-skilled jobs across city regions. And certainly there's a case for, when it comes to better connecting people up to jobs, it's certainly not just about transport, it's about a whole raft of things to do with planning and housing and arguably we can do better, but I think there are probably lots of examples where we do get it right as well. So,
Robert Mitchell, Essex County Council. I realise it's a long way from Yorkshire, but another thing being discussed. Just as an example, in Essex recently, there has been a significant consultation on the three-lane of the A12 between Chelmsford and Marks Tate. Much of that might mean nothing to you, but that was very welcome because the funding was already in place for it. At the same time, there is a necessity to fill in the gap, which is another smaller road, the A120, which basically goes from Stansted to Harwich, if that makes any sense to anybody. And there's a bit of it that isn't dual and is an absolute nightmare. As the gentleman was saying from West Yorkshire, if the road was perhaps before, you can wrap it out. Basically, that bit we don't have funding for. Essex County Council have dipped into their pocket in order to do the consultation in the same way that Highways England have done the consultation on the 12. So in other words, it brings it up the list by a couple of years by investment locally in order to do the consultation in the way that Highways England and the government and the ministers would expect it to be done, to get the buy-in from local authorities and from the public, such that we can go to government and get funding, push it up the line to make it a joined up project because the A120 actually connects, or needs to connect somewhere with the A12. And one of the new junctions that will be built on the A12 is in order to dovetail the eventual building so that the two, you can build, if you build one slightly before the other, you can build a junction ready for but not with, and then you just join up the road. It makes the whole process much simpler. It's the first opportunity in about 80 years to do this sort of joined up thinking along with a large 24,000 homes, garden, city potential development that will be within that same sort of area. So it's trying to bring everything together, and there is an example, there are other examples I'm sure around the country of doing similar sort of thing.
Okay, any questions? Gentleman right at the back there. Yeah.
Chris Bell from Conservative Transport Group. There's emerging, apparently, early success showing programme to have a digital railway, which includes in-cab signalling and things like that. In many places, it's been reported that, particularly for the House of Lords, where it was reported consistently with other reports, that as soon as a route is completed, then you get upwards of 40% increase in capacity, increasingly around 20 to 30% reduction in operating costs, and therefore the cost of travel. Should this programme be given a big boost by everybody that's got a stake in it and become a national priority, you have the benefits?
David, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so the question's around should we make a big shift into in-cab signalling in our railways because of the capacity and cost benefit. I think the truth is we're going to have to because as our existing infrastructure becomes life expired, we won't actually be able to replace it with what's there today, because other railways in the world are replacing with in-cab systems, and that's going to be really what you're going to the only thing you're going to be able to buy for many of our routes. So we do need to make that shift. It is something that our franchise actually planned for. We expected the infrastructure to be delivered on the East Coast Main Line by 2019. Now the timescales have moved out because of Network Rail's review of its own investment plans. But our new trains are coming equipped with it. Of course, the trains are going to have a 30-year life, so they're going to be ready for it. And just this week, we're putting in simulators into our train crew depot down in London King's Cross, where we'll be training our drivers on the new trains. The simulators are also equipped so that we can train those drivers with the in-cab signalling. So we're getting ready. We've been working together with Network Rail over the last 6 months, actually trying to make the case again for this investment to be made. The government, I think, have got a £450 million fund to get this work started. So we've been trying to make the case for some of that money so the infrastructure works can get underway. But it's expensive stuff. I think the cost of the scheme on the East Coast Main Line will be about £1 billion. So even with the amount that the government have currently put up, it's only going to get us started.
Either of you two? Yeah, sorry.
James Ransloff from the North East England Chamber of Commerce. You've all given good, convincing arguments as to why investment in transport can indeed boost growth. But fundamentally, when projects are put to the Department for Transport, the assessment process is about solving yesterday's problems rather than delivering tomorrow's solutions. It's more about solving congestion, and the whole way that the business case assessment process works actually continues to favour projects in London and the South East against those that deliver real economic growth in the North. How would you go about trying to transform that approach?
Naomi, do you want to talk about valuing time savings and all that?
I'm not an expert in transport appraisal, but I know that there's definitely an argument for looking at transport appraisals in terms of how they support economic growth more generally, and reviewing that. So certainly I think it's an excellent question and one that needs to be addressed. I can't get into the technicalities of it, sorry.
Carl?
Give us the money in the north and we will spend it.
Fair enough. Just devolve. Yeah. And David?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit more sophisticated than that, but we've clearly got to make the case. We've got to celebrate the success stories. One example I'd share is Corby. I was involved in opening the new station in a previous job. The new station at Corby, which opened in 2009. When it opened, Corby had an unemployment rate of 9%, which was higher than the regional average. And now in Corby, the unemployment rate's 4%, which is better than the regional average. And that's because the strategy was to provide a station with a service to London that enable people in Corby to get access to jobs in London. And transport was part of the solution to regenerating Corby as a town. It can be done, and that's what we're looking to do in Middlesbrough with the launch of a similar level of service as we did in Corby.
Yeah.
David Slight from Buckinghamshire Council. Although I think we're talking about Yorkshire, I did soldier for 5 years in the town of York, or the city of York rather, and where I was always reminded that with 125 mile running on the East Coast Main Line, journey times have come down dramatically, but it still took an hour to get to Scarborough. 2 points really, that on car parking at railway stations, that while there is a significant business case when you're able to charge significant amounts for car parking and get a fare of, say, an average fare of £50, then you can build a business case. When you're looking at some rural station and even Northallerton or Thirsk, there may not be quite the business case for that. What role is there for the local authorities in looking at and provision of when we build housing and railways, we should be trying to provide the access to the railway via new railway stations. Getting a new railway station is not easy in any way, and perhaps Carl could tell me how Strensel is getting on.
I'll try and kick off with that, and I'll just deflect that because that's in York, and I have little knowledge of what's happening in York with regard to Strensel, but I understand that Strensel has been declared surplus by the MOD, and I think the City of Council would like to zone that for housing, but the people in Strensel don't want that to happen. They'd rather have their Army Heath there. I mean, you make an interesting point about stations and the like, and of course in North Yorkshire we're blessed with the two-tier system. So the district councils are making some land use decisions and the county councils inputting into those, but by and large we actually do work together quite well. You're right about Thirsk and Northallerton stations, Thirsk in particular, where there isn't any land at all next to the station for further car parking, and that's where we get the bad neighbour situation. But we're actually talking with Network Rail and the county and Hambleton District Council, because they've allocated a lot of land just south of Thirsk at what they call Sowerby Gateway, and there's talk now that the right thing to do is to move Thirsk railway station to Sowerby and actually do an integrated station there. And Hambleton District Council are going through their local plan process at the moment and have allocated a bit of land that somebody wanted to build houses on, and they've said no, we're going to preserve that for railway parking. So we can get it right when we talk to each other.
David?
Yeah, so in the last year we've provided, I think, 900 extra parking spaces at our stations, and they've pretty much been used, taken up very quickly. It's about that balance, of course. I think, we've got to provide the parking, but it's also these days about providing extra cycling facilities. That's something, again, we've been doing over the last year. Because people will take these alternatives if we provide them. You've got to be able to leave your bike at a station knowing that it will still be there when you come back, and so that's where we've been putting some of our efforts. But just as the use of the railway keeps going, the pressure on things like station car parks, I'm finding is immense, and we have got to work out a way to match the provision, match the demand with provision.
Yes, if you're going for a train, you want the certainty of being able to park your car.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Gentleman right at the back.
Thank you. Michael Flynn from Eddisbury, but I have a day job that keeps away from politics, which is I'm head of consulting at Transport for London. And I wanted to push back against this idea that seems to be gathering pace, that I'm going to leave here this afternoon, light my cigar and roll up £20 notes while I lounge in my bar full of tennis. We do have lots of money in London. It is a very, very large business. Crossrail, for example, is a £15 billion railway, but we found the cash for over half of that. And the same rules are available to other people and other municipalities elsewhere in the country. We receive no money from the vehicle excise duty, but we maintain all of London's principal roads and London's traffic control system out of our own road. So we, from our perspective, don't feel that we are being unduly favoured. What has happened over the last 7 or 8 years is a lot of schemes have come in from other cities to central government, and they have been underdeveloped, underplanned, and undercosted. And this has been a huge issue for Downing Street and for the Parliament. I got approached before the European referendum and the previous Prime Minister by the Cabinet Office to ask if we could support other authorities around the country in developing their business cases, because they wanted to give them money. There's a need out there, they wanted to spend the money, but the business cases that were coming in weren't sufficiently developed.
Naomi, is that a problem kind of local civil service capacity? I know we see that in lots of other areas.
Well, I think there is an issue of how you build local capacity as you're devolving more more powers and resources down to the local level. And I know that there have been a lot of figures bounded around about the kind of levels of investment in London versus the rest. And the GLA, I know, have... Well,
we're finding money, half the money ourselves at Crossrail, that's open to everyone else. Everyone else operates under the same rules.
Yeah.
We're going to be the only capital city next year in the world, major capital city in the world, that receives no central government subsidy for a transport system at all. Yeah,
I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. I was about to say that I know the GLA have published figures that if you look at levels of investment versus the number of journeys made, for instance, into London and around London, then actually I think it brings it below the national average. So I think, there are different ways of looking at it, aren't there? But yeah, I think that certainly we need to kind of build capacity and enable those types of investment to take place in other parts of the country too.
Carl?
I'm not going to enter into an argument about the quantum, about the north-south divide or whatever. All I'm saying is for the money that we're going to be allowed to spend in the north on northern projects, let local decision makers decide where the priorities are.
Fair enough. And David, you?
No, I mean, I think it's good if we can work out how London does succeed and talk about how do we make the case for investment more regionally, then we should. It's good to hear those conversations are taking place. But I'm struck by, I think, some of the previous arguments that were made when the Northern Powerhouse was imagined. We do need to sort of get stuff going before we can realise the sort of opportunity that might materialise in 20 years' time. We've got to kickstart it, and I think that's the conversation we're having.
The lady just there.
From Campaign for Better Transport. I would like to hear from the panel how buses fit into all of this, because more journeys are made every day by bus than by rail, and I think, especially in view of the fact that the majority of job seekers don't have access to a car, and connectivity with rail as well, boosting regional growth has a huge amount to do with creating better bus networks that are integrated with wider transport. I think exciting things are happening. The Liverpool Bus Alliance, and what examples of the panel got of how that can work well.
Yeah, good question. Carl?
Yeah, in North Yorkshire, 85% of our buses are actually commercial services, and we only subsidise 15%, and we subsidise the ones that aren't, by necessity, aren't commercial, and they're not got enough people on them. But I mean, since the Second World War, we've had declining bus use in the rural areas as more and more people have had the aspiration to own their own car, so that they can go to where they want to go at the time that they want to go and the time that they want to come back. What we have done very successfully in the last half a dozen years in North Yorkshire is we've introduced community transport, and where it's organised, but actually you get volunteer drivers, so you take out the labour cost. So we're quite happy to actually provide a community with a minibus because we have capital receipts that we can spend on that. And then we find community groups coming together to actually provide the service itself. And that does work well. But we do have overall a declining bus use because people want to use their own transport.
Naomi?
Well, I would agree. I think buses are incredibly important, particularly when you look at city region transport. I think 2/3 of journeys are made by bus, but of course alongside rural areas you're seeing declining bus usage in a lot of our cities and city regions as well. So I think as I was saying, I think the buses bill is incredibly important to enable city regions to regulate those. But it's also finding ways to invest in the bus networks locally. And I know, for instance, that Nottingham has done well on that front in terms of using its workplace parking levy to invest in its bus system, as well as other local priorities. But yeah, I think the buses bill is really important, and looking for ways to invest in buses, because it is an incredibly important part of how we make the most of kind of investments in rail and big infrastructure projects too.
David, do you agree?
Yeah, I think for a business like mine, you don't see many customers, some do, but you don't see many transfer between the train and buses actually. It tends to be a sort of different market that we're serving, but it goes back to what we were saying about car parks and cycling. It is part of the mix that we need to make sure we are catering for and boosting where possible. In terms of how people access the rail network.
Why don't you see the mix between the two? Is that a demographic thing?
Yeah, I think the demographics. I think when you find that many of our customers are leaving London in the evening, they're getting back to the regions at a time when the bus services have sort of wound down. So inevitably they don't tend to they tend to look for other modes of transport to get them home. But that we have a number of initiatives where we're developing smarter travel plans at our stations in conjunction with the local authorities and other transport operators to see if there are some quick wins that will improve services and the interchange.
Okay, I think it's probably our final round of questions. If anyone's got any more. Okay, there you go.
The way that Transport provides the services is obviously very different.
Name, by the way, and organisation.
My name's Clayton. The way that Transport provides services is obviously very different to the rest of different privatised network providers in terms of it's the stakeholders opposed to the shareholder or vice versa. Does that make a service more important? Does that therefore create a bubble hub that you're able to invest your services within London and extend your services within that because you're putting back into the services as opposed to putting back into the profit that may not go back into the services as such?
Yeah.
Can you give any light on that as such? Because there's quite a difference between providing for shareholders, which are your passengers, as opposed to stakeholders, which are in it to make a profit on the service, that leaves some money aside to put into the service, but holds some money back for their own profit.
David, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think let's be clear. The projects we're delivering, which will deliver with new trains, more services for customers, will generate hopefully additional revenue. But that additional revenue doesn't go back to shareholders; it goes back to central government. So we're paying 30% more already than when we took over the franchise. I think the difference between a TfL type model and our model is that to deliver that we need to work really closely with our infrastructure provider, who is Network Rail, who operate within a slightly different framework. We have a 7-year or 8-year contract. They go through 5-yearly funding cycles. They're government owned, we're privately owned, so we have different rules by which we spend our money and are governed, etc. So there's a bit of a mismatch. And it requires working together to deliver it, but that's what we are now doing with, I believe, increasing effectiveness.
Either of you two want to comment?
I've spent all my working life trying to make a profit, and I don't think there's anything wrong in making a profit as long as profit is reasonable.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much for coming along. Thank you to Virgin for sponsoring us, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you.